So what are these processes of consciousness that I was talking about there? Well, they're the ways in which consciousness moves to shape itself, essentially, to shape the reality that we experience. Our reality is our internal experience being reflected outside. We know that. Psychologists know that. The great yogic masters know that. It was, but we forget that. We think that we're experiencing something outside, but the experience is actually inside. These processes apply to every experience, every thought, every perception, at every moment, for every person, no matter what the mind constructs that we're engaging in. Two of the primary processes of consciousness I've sort of mentioned already, and that's contraction and expansion. Basically, consciousness is consciousness, but it can expand and it can contract. It remains the same, but it contracts or it expands along a continuum. This is happening all the time. Right now, as you're listening, you'll have a position somewhere along the continuum. You may be creating different connections with what I'm saying, so you're more in an expanded state when you're doing that. Or you may think this is a load of crap, in which case you're more in the contracted state because you're closing down. That's what happens when clients come to you. They come to you with a more contracted state of awareness because they've got a problem. And the problem is, if you like, a contraction of their understanding of the world. It's not necessarily how the world is, but it's their understanding of the world. And the task is to be able to get them out of that by moving into a more expanded state so they can take the leap into another way of thinking about things. That's a simple way of expressing it. The contraction or contracted state of awareness generally tends to separate us from what's going on. So we start to contract into individual elements of existence. It's sort of a reductionist process. It tends to be more locked into the senses and the mind. So it's in terms of what I'm talking about here, it's the least conscious state. And unfortunately, that's the way that we're often taught and trained through education to think. So we break everything down into components. That gives us to some degree an understanding, but it also takes us out of the whole, out of the overall understanding. Yoga Vasishtha it's a great text, wonderful text. It's all about this. Extraordinary text. If you ever get a copy of it, my recommendation would you to get the copy that was translated by a yogi called Venkatesananda. I met him many years back, a lovely guy, and very, very evolved guy, but it's a superbly translated book, this one. And the Yoga Vasishtha, I'll take a couple of excerpts from that. This one says that when the mind gets involved in the external objective universe, it moves away from the self, from that higher understanding. At the expanded end, that level of awareness unites as opposed to separates. This is good beyond the senses and the mind. You still have the senses and the mind, but it's more expansive state. It's considered to be a higher state of awareness. So what we're doing with the coaching is moving up and down along these lines. Generally, the peak states are in this sort of range here that we're talking about you see on the screen. Most of our awareness is within the yellow section there. Most of the time, our awareness is more geared towards the senses and to thinking in a way that is more logical, rational. Again, reductionist, segmented. That's how we tend to think. That's how we tend to be trained to think. We analyze things, but every now and then we go to the other end of the spectrum and experience these peak states, the shift of awareness. Artists and inventors and entrepreneurs tend to be more at the right-hand side of the continuum, more into the expanded awareness, where they see connections in a different way. And they come up with intuitive insights and then start to put it into play through developing creative strategies for doing things that haven't been done before. So what we're doing is working along part of the spectrum, and the peak states generally tend to be in that upper section. David Hawkins, you might be familiar with, he's a psychiatrist, he died a few years back. But he at one time experienced a another massive shift in his awareness at one point, and he started to explore what that was. He spent 10 years in the desert, I think it was, trying to figure out what this was that occurred to him. And then he began to formulate a model of the different levels of consciousness. He read a book called Power versus Force, and it's got some interesting concepts in it. He looked at it from the point of view of it at the contracted end of consciousness. He said, basically, this is where people use force. It involves guilt, apathy, fear, anger, ego, slavery, pride, blame, all those things. It's where you're trying to force the world to conform in some way. So on the other hand, there's power, which is a totally different way of operating. I like to think of it as what Yoda would do. If the force is with you, just focus on the force. But he talks about power as having different characteristics: the courage, the trust, the optimism, gives meaning, as meaningfulness, and harmony, creativity, and love and joy. These are the characteristics that arise with people in those states. Maslow had something similar. He actually said that his greatest insight was that the descriptions that people gave of peak states also were descriptions of values that they had. So they experienced a state of goodness or beauty that also was the value that they were experiencing with that. It was the thing that was really important to them. It was the thing that generated, if you like, or came along with that state. And this is important because things like effortlessness and transformation and awe and joy, these are the things that the athletes describe. And Kathy Freeman, who's the gold medalist at Sydney Olympics in the 400 meters, it's worth looking at her race on TV. The way she moves was just extraordinary. It was just no effort whatsoever to pull that gold medal out of the bag. And she said, basically, she runs for awe and joy. She doesn't run for the medal, she runs for awe and joy. She said, if you can do that, then you can not only enjoy running, but you can run in a way that you've never run before. The importance of these values, but Maslow called them B values or being values, the values of being. So again, it's moving into this idea of self rather than things. So these values tie in with what Hawkins said, and the importance of it here is that in coaching, as I mentioned before, the idea of having a purpose is extremely important, a higher purpose and challenge, if you like, to expand awareness. But also it's important in coaching to tie that in with the value system, because the values themselves will enable people to step up to a higher level of awareness. When people focus on, and it's part of the idea of a lot of, for instance, Buddhist techniques, Buddhist tradition, when you focus on the values, the mind begins to shift to accommodate the values, and that generates a different state of awareness. So the values are actually a means of doing these things as well. So in coaching, it's really important to be able to get the client to understand the values behind what it is that they want to do. And that means getting them to understand the impact, for instance, that they're going to have on others. And is that going to be something that will work for them and for others in the long run? Then they decide on the values, and they can adapt their strategy to make sure that the values are looked after. We do the same thing at the corporate level with the corporate values, but you need to tie it in also with the individuals, because the values actually operate at the point of choice. It's that choice point that I mentioned before, between the stimulus and the response, there's a choice. There's an idea, you've got a choice which way you're going to do it.